So Phoenix Games is a company known pretty much exclusively for putting out a near never-ending supply of god-awful shovelware. To the point where the mere presence of its logo on a cover is enough to stop someone from even trying the game. And it got me thinking, considering how bad their games are, what is the best thing that Phoenix ever made and or published? Because surely there has to be a diamond in the rough somewhere. So I went online, chose a bunch of Phoenix games, and I played them. All of them, just to find out if they ever made something that wasn't heinous. Now before I start, I want to clear a few things up. Firstly, I'm aware I'm missing out on some of their games, since I didn't have the time or willpower to play everything that Phoenix ever made, so I may have missed out on their magnum opus. Also, I won't be including the infamous puzzle games like Pinocchio or Snow White and the Seven Clever Boys, mainly because 1, they're definitely not contenders for the best game.
No, don't run off, Pinocchio!
And 2, because there's far too much to unpack and they really do deserve their own videos. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's find out if Phoenix ever made a decent video game. So the premise of these games is fairly straightforward, simply shoot down enough enemies and move on to the next level. Oh, and they're the same game, even down to the menus. It does kind of explain why a World War I biplane can shoot homing missiles and Space Rebellion isn't set in space. Also, considering the spaceship also shoots homing missiles and looks like an upside down jet, I'm willing to bet there's another reskin I just didn't come across. Anyway, in terms of gameplay, these games are arse. You've got terrible controls, horrible graphics, mechanics that barely work, boring repetitive gameplay, and rampant artificial difficulty that'll cause you to die seemingly out of nowhere. However, despite being a reskin, Combat Ace does seem to be the worst of the two. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're both terrible, but Combat Ace seems to have all the issues I've described, but they're twice as bad. Either way, don't play these games, because they're both horrible, top-tier shovelware that provide no enjoyment whatsoever. So despite its name, Crabby Adventure is the furthest thing from an adventure you could possibly get, because the definition of adventure is an unusual, exciting, or daring experience, and this is none of those things. And yes, I know I'm not supposed to take it literally, but all it is a basic as they come minigame where the goal is to eliminate coloured balls with ones of the same colour before they surround you. That's it. I mean, yeah, the menus are better than the last games, and I suppose it functions, but all of the 3 game modes are the same, and by the same I mean painfully dull. Honestly, you get bored of this just as quick as the last 2. So yeah, Crabby Adventure, I suppose it's alright in that it works, but other than that, no enjoyment to be had at all. So this is the first in a long line of shitty racing games. However, this, honestly, I'm not even sure where to begin. And anyone who saw this and thought, yeah, that's good to go, quite frankly should be ashamed of themselves. Because with a name like Doomsday Racers combined with the fact that on the loading screen there's a car being hit by a missile, you'd assume this is a combat-based racing game. It's not. In fact, there are no weapons in this entire thing. However, it's not so much the lack of weapons that bothers me, it's more the fact how badly they've managed to fuck up everything else. Firstly, the handling is disgraceful, and when paired with the unnecessarily narrow tracks, all you do is fucking crash. Unless of course you're the AI who can still bomb around corners with absolutely no trouble. On top of that, when you do inevitably crash, there's a pretty high chance that your car's wheels will clip into the ground, meaning you can't move. And if that doesn't happen, you'll just fall through the map entirely. Seriously, how they even publish this is beyond me. It's horrible, unplayable, don't even bother trying it. Couldn't play it, but from the footage I saw on YouTube, I'm sure it's a 10 out of 10. So Guerrilla Strike is a top-down shooter where you play as a helicopter, and the objective is pretty much the same as the first 2 games. shoot a bunch of enemies and move on to the next level. Although unlike the first two games, this isn't nearly as unbearable. In fact, the controls are actually pretty good, and you don't die in one hit, which is something I really could have done with earlier on. However, despite the improvements, I really can't recommend it. The game becomes boring in about 5 minutes, especially with the appalling choice of music. Now, normally I wouldn't have a huge problem with it, but when a game is this simple, having to listen to looped elevator music with a higher tempo really doesn't help add to the excitement. And at the end of the day, I can only really rank it slightly above Combat Ace. So from this game's title, I imagine you can tell what it's trying to capitalise on, and in true Phoenix game fashion, it has absolutely nothing to do with it. Hell, I wouldn't even call this a fucking cooking game because it's obviously a platformer, unless the mere presence of food somehow turns it into cooking mama. Anyway, this is the first game on the list with an actual story, in Comic Sans. Apparently, there are two expert chefs called Cookie and Bread who cook magical food, and when all the villagers are kidnapped by a giant, Bread has to cook him the best food in the world and he'll let them go. Yeah, it's not great. Also, world's best food is very much open to interpretation since everyone likes different things. But then again, it's shovelware, so the fact it even has a plot is pretty impressive. Anyway, the goal here is to make all the different bits of food drop into the baskets below, and once that's done, you complete the stage. Sounds simple. It's not. I mean, the first two stages are okay, but when the game introduces enemies, it pretty much all goes to shit. See, while you have the ability to attack them, you can't actually walk past them once they're stunned. Instead, you have to turn into fucking bread, let them go past you, turn back, then run off. And with controls more delayed than Wish.com delivery times, this clearly isn't very easy to do. And even when you do manage it, the enemies are so fast and their hitboxes are so fucked that you'll likely just get hit anyway. Honestly, if the controls weren't so garbage, this could have been a perfectly serviceable platformer. But as it stands, it's far more frustrating than it is fun. So Drag Racer USA, much like Doomsday Racers, is another incredibly misleading racing game. However, that's not really surprising since it's from the same people who developed Doomsday Racers, so that'll probably give you some idea of what it's going to be like. Basically, this game has you racing very slowly around tracks with multiple corners, which if you haven't already realised, isn't drag racing. And apart from that, it's just Doomsday Racers all over again. Just without the game-breaking glitches and a soundtrack so bad, it sounds like it was made by an 8-year-old. I mean, it does have customization, which I guess is something, but then again, no matter how much you customize your car, the gameplay will still suck. And it isn't drag racing, so it doesn't really matter. So from this game's name, you'd expect it to be a sort of fun thing you play with a bunch of family or friends. However, in reality, it's the kind of thing where if you did invite people to play this, they'd wonder what the fuck you were thinking. This genuinely has to be one of the dullest things I've ever played in my life. I mean, yeah, it works well enough, but just look at this. Who on earth would want to play this, let alone invite others to? Its pacing is so slow, and when combined with the incredibly monotonous music, I honestly found myself on the verge of nodding off. Genuinely, the only nice thing I could say about this is it's more stable than some of the other entries, but apart from that, don't play this, unless of course you have sleep issues, in which case you'll be out like a light in 5 minutes. So these are another set of reskins, which again explains why the Wild West has Uzi submachine guns and modern day terrorists still use dynamite. Also, Sniper Assault doesn't actually have any sniping, but let's be honest, at this point if the title actually reflected the content of the game, I'd be disappointed. Anyway, as you can see, these games are pretty basic. Simply run around, shoot all the people you can see, then move on. And you know what? It's actually not too bad. I mean, yeah, it's not perfect, but it honestly feels like the sort of arcade game I'd play when I was younger. The controls are solid, it works properly, and the soundtrack is scarily good for a Phoenix game. So you know what? Deadeye Jim and Sniper Assault, they're not bad. They won't keep you occupied for very long, but they can be fun. So with the half-decent games out of the way, it's time to get back to the tidal wave of garbage, and in this case, it's 2 more reskins. And before you ask, no. As far as I'm aware, there is no Pro Biker 1. Anyway, as mentioned, these are shameless reskins of each other, with the only difference being one has BMXs and the other has motorbikes. However, they do share one thing, in that they are both absolutely horrendous. Now, the main issues are pretty much the same as Doomsday Racers and Drag Racer USA, mainly because they're made by the same people again. However, they're so much worse here, largely because the controls are even worse this time around, and the tracks don't have barriers, so staying on them is a Herculean feat. I should also add that while it was most likely an emulator bug, horrible, ear-piercing sound effects would loop constantly, meaning my time with an already bad game was made even worse because it sounded like this. So yeah, some truly horrible games made even more unbearable by an audio bug. Just don't play them. Again, couldn't play it, but considering the footage on YouTube uses the exact same music, models and moves as World Wrestling Championship, I have a feeling it's not going to be great. So the first thing you might notice about this game is the title. It's spelt wrong. Apart from that, it's essentially just a visually upgraded but less functional version of Puzzle Party. Basically, you have a selection of different games ranging from mini golf, table football, shooting ranges, dodgems and hovercraft racing. And then you play them. That's it. Now on the whole they function fine, and by that I mean the golf, football and shooting function fine. The last two, well they're a different story entirely. Firstly, what this game calls dodgems really is just a timed survival challenge, since you can't actually damage your opponents. But then again, even if you wanted to, the breakneck speeds of the gameplay and terrible controls mean you really can't do that. Then you have the hovercraft racing where the controls are fine, but the water is very clearly sand that's been coloured blue, and it doesn't have any collision, meaning you can do this. Like the only other time I've seen such a lack of collision was in big rigs over the road racing. Now don't get me wrong, it's not as bad as that, but when it reminds me of it, it can't be very good. So there's not really much to say about this one, other than, well, it's volleyball. You get a bunch of characters with different stats that you can customise, and then you play volleyball. The only thing I'd mention is the surprisingly steep learning curve. Now, I understand this isn't really an issue if you just keep playing the game, but in my opinion, it doesn't have the gameplay to keep you hooked long enough to learn it. But then again, if you're a fan and you can get past the learning curve, I suppose you might enjoy it. So this is the first Mario Kart ripoff on the list, and by God, is it one of the worst games I've ever experienced. Oh, and this is apparently one of the games that Phoenix developed and published, so they really only have themselves to blame. Anyway, it's your standard no-effort Mario Kart clone, featuring no more than 4 different characters who are clearly reskins, a grand total of 3 tracks, god-awful handling, and a power-up system that barely works. So as it turns out, the people that made Doomsday Racers and all those other masterpieces just weren't happy with only making racing games and decided, you know what, let's do something completely different. Snowboarding. Although despite the change in topic, it turned out pretty much the same. Firstly, whenever you're in the menus, the selection square will just shake violently, and I can't tell if it's a glitch or some weird creative decision. And apart from that, you know the drill. Horrible graphics, minimal content, and terrible controls that mean you can't help but crash every 10 seconds. Pure, unfiltered garbage that isn't worth playing. So it's pretty clear what this game is trying to replicate, and to my surprise, it's actually better. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, look at it. Honestly, it's the second best example of how not to make a skateboarding game, the first of course being The Simpsons. I mean, when they're so lazy they didn't even bother to include a pushing animation when you move, the quality of everything else doesn't need much explaining. Horrendous graphics, terrible controls that are on par if not worse than The Simpsons skateboarding, and characters that are all the same person. So after playing so many shitty games, when I came across Ocean Commander, I instantly assumed it was going to be Guerrilla Strike, but underwater. However, I couldn't have been more wrong, because this game is actually pretty good. I mean, yeah, all you do is play as a metal shark cruising through the ocean shooting stuff, but compared to everything else on this list, it's a masterpiece. You've got a good amount of content, weapon upgrades, enemy variety, bosses. Honestly, it reminds me a lot of the games I'd have a blast playing on Miniclip when I was younger. My only real complaint is that I found the aiming to be a bit too slow, but the upgrade system does help relieve that a bit. And again, it's not going to keep you occupied forever, but for a couple of hours it's perfectly fine. So if you do want to play a Phoenix game instead of playing literally anything else, then I'd suggest this, but make sure to emulate it because a physical copy will cost you more than a PlayStation 5. So that was the video, and I have to say that I'm impressed. Impressed that a developer can put out bad games so consistently, to the point where after playing 20 of them I found 2 that I enjoyed and 1 that I'd actually recommend. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.